slip the surly bonds of earth and dance the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Hi, and welcome to the 5th installment of the Dad Project. Glad to have you back as we travel tonight to the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland. When my dad first arrived, he was a test pilot under instruction for a period of 10 months, spanning January 1961 through October of the same year. Upon completion of his instructions with the 21 pilots in Class 32 of the United States Naval Air Test Pilot School, he would be designated an engineering test pilot, whereupon he would then spend the remainder of his 3 years as a test pilot in the Service Test Division of the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River. Well, that's 3 years in a nutshell and rather dry, so let's deviate a bit and look back on how pilots have been portrayed in the popular media, particularly Hollywood. We're all familiar with the picture of the Wright brothers' first flight on December 17, 1903, and by default, the first successful powered flight by a test pilot. But a quick look at their photographic portraits and a picture from their visit with President Taft at the White House on June 10, 1909, we don't recognize them as the dashing pilots we now associate with the boundary-pushing aviators that have been honed and refined through the media and Hollywood. We need first to get to the end and the other side of World War I to begin to see the pilot and ultimately the test pilot through our modern gaze. As World War I raged and became mired in the horrors of trench warfare, the noble nature of war and its necessity to carry out the whims and desires of the nation-state soured as body accounts defied logic on both sides of the conflict. It would be the newfangled flying machine that would rise figuratively and literally above the horrors of the trenches below, and their pilots celebrated and presented as the knights of the sky. The valor, chivalry, and pomp of the cavalry charge had literally been decimated by the machine gun. For the Americans, it would be the Ohio-born Eddie Rickenbacker of the Hat-in-the-Ring 94th Aero Squadron, with his 26 skills, who would return to the United States a hero, mobbed by crowds wherever he went, and like a movie idol, people would tear at his clothes and rip off his buttons. It would be a mythical flyer we remember to this day, Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, an ace with 80 kills as he flew with Jastas 4, 6, 10, and 11. This Jastagruppen 1 became known as the Flying Circus, or Richthofen Circus, because of the bright colors of its aircraft. Richthofen would be celebrated by the Germans and quietly admired by Allied pilots. In fact, when he was finally shot down on April 21, 1918, he was buried with full military honors by the Allies in France. But it would be Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis in 1927 that would truly ignite a worldwide media storm at the same level as the moonshot 50-odd years later and elevate Lindbergh to an unprecedented level of fame. He would be dubbed the Lone Eagle, a moniker that continued to define pilots as singular entities bred from the loins of authors' knights, just as the aces of the earlier war had been. Hollywood, for its part, had made a few low-budget films and serials having to do with pilots and aircraft during the heyday of the silent picture. But it would be at the tail end of that era in 1927 that Paramount Pictures put up an unheard of $2 million budget for the silent picture Wings. the story of two boyhood friends that go off to war as pilots, but only one returns, having been grayed by the experience to a hero's welcome. Their brotherhood and chivalry, shown to and from their enemies, overshadows the horror they witnessed and participated in. The movie was a huge success, having the good fortune of being released on the heels of Lindbergh's transatlantic flight and the public's adoration of all things aviation because of it. It didn't hurt that Paramount had hedged its bet by installing the it girl Clara Bow being part of the cast. The icing on the cake would be the first Best Picture Oscar being bestowed on Wings, it being the only true silent film to win that award. Any number of films about pilots and their daring do followed Wings, but it wouldn't be until 1938 with the movie Test Pilot that Hollywood again would help define the public perception of the pilot, the test pilot, this time in the handsome gaze of Clark Gable with his sidekick Spencer Tracy. It was nominated for Best Picture, but bested by The Life of Emile Zola. Now, Zola's involvement in the Dreyfus affair is a fascinating story. His novel, Germinal, has long been a favorite of mine, and as an amateur photographer, he took a beautiful picture of a balloon in flight, but no well-orchestrated flying scenes graced his biopic, so 2 thumbs down. And then, just like that, war was forgiven and the world did its best to destroy itself once again. And it would be pilots, particularly fighter pilots, that again would be elevated to the Knights of the Sky. Major Dick Bong of the 49th Fighter Group, the Flying Knights, and several other pilots attached to the 49th and other groups within the 9th Air Force were followed like baseball players hitting home runs, as their kill totals put them well past the 5 needed to be considered an ace. Bong would finish on top of that deadly tote board with 40 kills, the top scoring American ace in his P-38. This paled in comparison to the top German ace, Erich Hartmann, who scored 342 kills with the Karaya Staffel on the Eastern Front in an Me-109. Bong would die in 1946 while test flying the Lockheed P-80, while Hartmann would go on to a successful career in the West German Air Force. Following the war, the jet age began in earnest. With the jet expanding the flight envelope to unheard of altitudes and speeds, the public once again was taken by the aircraft and their pilots as they pushed the bounds of flight as one record after another was challenged and bested. The sound barrier was a goal that was approached with a great deal of trepidation, as there was a strong belief that the transonic drag induced at the barrier would tear the aircraft apart. Unbeknownst to the general public, the U.S. Air Force had developed the X-1, rocket-powered test platform to take on that barrier. And on October 14, 1947, after being dropped from a B-29 mothership, Chet Yeager piloted the glamorous Glenna, named for his wife, to Mach 1.06 over Rogers Dry Lake. The notoriety and fame generated by that feat was so universal that the Air Force would strap Yeager in the latest fighter well after his retirement to commemorate that accomplishment. For the last time, when he flew as a co-pilot in an F-15 at the ripe old age of 89 in 2012. Today, we know Rogers Dry Lake as Edwards Air Force Base, named for Captain Glenn Edwards, who had perished while test flying the Northrop YB-49 Flying Wing in 1948. He was very well thought of as a test pilot, and he was initially chosen to fly the X-1 that would catapult Yeager to public acclaim, but dead test pilots have limited PR value. One record after another would fall, and even John Glenn got into the act before he became an astronaut. Flying the reconnaissance version of the F-8U, he took off from Los Alamitos Naval Air Station in California and landed at Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn, New York, in 3 hours and 23 minutes, a record at the time. It was a flight test in the guise of a publicity stunt, as the main intention for the flight was to prove the J-57 engine could run at full afterburner in sustained flight. I know I've skipped over any number of books, movies, and personalities that are just as sanguine to this train of thought, but we'll end that train of thought with Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, a wonderful book and a decent movie. It is a well-written account of the military and civilian test pilots that lorded over Edwards Air Force Base in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, as one experimental test bed after another was flown to the extreme and retired, or crashed and burned, often with the pilot aboard. The pilots were characterized as hard-driving, hard-drinking, and hard-flying individuals that were fearless in the face of danger, that would unwind at Poncho Barnes' Happy Bottom Riding Club. More than a few of these individuals would soon become the ultimate test pilots, the ultimate public persona of the test pilot, the Mercury 7 astronauts. There were 7 requirements for the prospective astronaut candidates, one of them being that they had to be a graduate of a test pilot school. That immediately winnowed the field to 508 candidates. Their service jackets were forwarded to the selection committee, and the field narrowed again to 110 candidates. Further filtering through testing and physical exams brought the field to the 7 astronauts we are familiar with today, and the pinnacle of the public's perception of the test pilot, the astronaut. Well, what have we learned? Let's review. It seems that if Hollywood has anything to do with modeling a test pilot, that person would have Clark Gable's good looks, a fearlessness that mortal man has no conception of, nerves of steel, a daring and cockiness that sings "You've Got That Loving Feeling" at the O Club, and likes to buzz the tower. Or, as Maverick CO says, "Son, your ego is writing checks your body can't cash." The military, on the other hand, wants very intelligent, very talented pilots with an engineering background. No flat hatters or tower buzzers. Test flying at its root is a very dull progression of putting an aircraft through its paces in as many flight parameters as the engineers and admirals think their aircraft may face, and to recover should there be any anomalies. More on anomalies in a later installment. And, as you might expect, the perfect candidate is a cross between the Navy and Hollywood. My dad had the good looks, as you can see from his Academy portrait, and the cockiness, as you can see from his photograph from Pensacola. But cocky, good-looking pilots are a dime a dozen. So without a very talented stick and being very intelligent, there was little chance of him being accepted into a very selective program. The 10 months he would spend as a test pilot under instruction would be hours of classroom instruction, hours of flying, and hours of report writing every day. It would be like drinking from a fire hose, hackneyed but appropriate. So a typical day would consist of a couple hours of perhaps aerodynamics, an hour or so basic technical report writing, then your assignment. Fly the Grumman F-11F Tiger in a set flight profile, then induce a set of assigned inputs and write a report about the results. Repeat the next day, but instead of the F-11F, let's do the flight assignment in the FJ-4B Fury, and maybe the next day we'll do it in the F-4D Skyray, and the following day, just so you don't forget where you came from, let's do it in the S-2F. And to further mix it up, you're going to learn to fly helicopters. Moreover, he would be surrounded by 20 other very talented pilots. To one side of his assigned desk was future Rear Admiral Jim Flatley, who was well known for landing and taking off the deck of the USS Forrestal in a C-130 Hercules without an arresting hook or with the use of the catapult. On the other side was John Holtzclaw, who would be shot down with his radar intercept officer, John Burns, in their F-4J Phantom over Vietnam in 1968. Their rescue by Lieutenant J.G. Clyde Lassen and his crew and their UH-2 Sea Sprite would lead to Lassen being awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and the USS Lassen DDG-82 being named in his honor. Classmate Laddie Kimbrell co-authored with Page Turner estimates of the kill probability in target area family shelters that compares the safety of underground shelters versus basement fallout shelters within nuclear target areas. Duck and cover, kids. Classmate Lieutenant Dwight Owings would die while serving with Attack Squadron 42, based in Oceana, Virginia, when his A-6 Intruder exploded over the Chesapeake Bay in 1966. Classmate Gordon L. Petrie and his crew would fly their P-2E Neptune over the Arctic, measuring and mapping magnetic intensities to aid scientists to determine the underlying geology and structure of the Earth's crust in that area. He would fly out of Thule Air Force Base in Greenland. My dad flew an SP-2E Neptune in a similar program over the Canadian Arctic, but more on that in a later installment. Classmate Samuel Sayers would go on to test fly the new A-6 Intruder, then flying the same for 2 tours in Vietnam, and from 1989 to 1990, he was the technical advisor for the movie Flight of the Intruder. Following my dad's graduation, he would be assigned to test the Fulton Aero Retriever System, better known as Skyhook, that would look at the viability of the system for pilot recovery and rescue at sea. The program would be carried out in a very familiar airframe, the Stoof. So, join me next time when we take a closer look at that program and my dad's involvement in it. In any case, thanks for joining me for the 5th installment of the Dad Project. I'm telling the story I was hoping my dad would tell me. Now, I'm telling it for him. So, please subscribe if you'd like to hear more. And until next time, thanks for watching and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.